Welcome to episode 325 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to, once again, Charles Chuck Stuber, who served in the FBI for 28 years. In this episode, he reviews his investigation of John Edwards, the former North Carolina United States Senator and two-time presidential candidate who faced charges for an alleged campaign finance law violation during his 2008 run for the White House. The accusation was that John Edwards used political donations to conceal from the public an ongoing extramarital affair which had resulted in pregnancy. The accusations were dramatic, but the investigation and trial had an unexpected outcome. Chuck Stuber's first FBI assignment was to the Denver FBI office, where he worked white-collar crime, violent crime, fugitives, and joined SWAT. After a transfer to the Washington Field Office, WFO, Chuck was assigned to the U.S. House of Representatives Bank Task Force, investigating members of Congress for misusing their accounts at the House Bank. Chuck received an Attorney General Distinguished Service Award for his work. Based on his successes, Chuck received a specialty transfer to the Charlotte FBI Division, Raleigh Resident Agency, to start a public corruption program. While assigned to the Raleigh RA, Chuck investigated and prosecuted numerous public officials, including U.S. Congressman Frank Balance, North Carolina District Court Judge Gary Balance, North Carolina House of Representatives member Mike Decker, North Carolina Governor Mike Easley, and, as he reviewed in episode 253, North Carolina Speaker Jim Black, as well as John Edwards, the subject of the investigation we're reviewing today. Chuck was also a hostage negotiator in the Charlotte Division and was involved in several cases resulting in the release of hostages and kidnapped victims. Chuck currently is a partner with SRS Consulting Services, LLC, consulting on white-collar crime and corruption cases, forensic accounting matters, and other types of investigations. He also teaches at Wake Technical Community College in both the criminal justice and accounting programs. I never know where my conversations with retired FBI employees will take me. I want to thank Chuck Stuber for his willingness to be open and emotional with us. At the end of his case review, he shares a life-changing decision he made when faced with a work-life balance choice involving the John Edwards trial. This episode is dedicated to Chuck and Janet Stuber's son, Alexander Alex Stuber. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find links to where you can join my reader team to keep up with the FBI and books, TV, and movies. Buy me a cup of coffee and learn more about me in my nonfiction book, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, and my two FBI crime novels, Pay to Play and Greedy Givers, all available as ebooks and paperbacks wherever books are sold, and audiobooks on Audible and Spotify. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent Charles Stuber. Hey, Chuck, how are you?
I'm doing fine. Thank you.
Well, the last time we spoke, I found out that you were the case agent for the John Edwards political finance corruption case. And I was so excited. Now, that was a few years ago that we spoke. Matter of fact, I think that episode, we did that in February of 2022 is when it came out. And I have been trying to chase you down since then to get you back on to record this case review. So I'm glad that you were able to chat about this case.
Yeah, I think we spoke in the last case. It was the Jim Black case, the Speaker of the House in North Carolina. So I'm glad I can come back and talk with you again on your show.
So, John Edwards, tell us a little bit about him and then start wherever you want to start.
Well, I tell you what, I will start a little bit with Edward's background, my background, and I'm actually from North Carolina, and I started out in the FBI Denver, Colorado was my first office, and then Washington, D.C., and then I got transferred back to Raleigh to start a public corruption initiative down there. John Warner, that was a supervisor at the time, and wanted to get some work going in the public corruption area, and I'd worked public corruption up in Washington, and so he brought me back to North Carolina, and this was 1998 when I came back. And John Edwards was a trial attorney in North Carolina, and he ran for the U.S. Senate in 1998 and one of the U.S. Senate seats for North Carolina. I'd ever really seen of John Edwards when he was running for Senate. I have to say, at the time, I liked the guy. He seemed like a good guy. He had a positive message. So much of politics these days is people with hateful rhetoric and slinging mud at each other, but he actually had a positive message. And I can't recall for sure, but I think actually may have voted for him in the election. I always vote the candidate rather than the party. I look at the candidates and their qualifications. And, I thought John Edwards, again, seemed like a positive person that hopefully could do good things for North Carolina. And I had high hopes for him, but they didn't exactly come to fruition when he got up to Washington, D.C. If I recall, he immediately got put on the Bill Clinton impeachment investigation. And I think he may have even done a deposition of Monica Lewinsky. And then that got him a lot of notoriety. And in 2000, Al Gore actually considered John Edwards as his running mate. He ultimately picked Joe Lieberman and not John Edwards, but that kind of put John Edwards on the radar even more. And then in 2003, John Edwards initiated a campaign to run for president and ran for president, was unsuccessful, lost to John Kerry. But John Kerry selected John Edwards to be his vice presidential running mate. And then they ended up losing the election to George Bush and Dick Cheney. But John Edwards, again, to fast forward ahead, he actually ran for president again, as we'll talk about. And he started his campaign in late 2006 and ran in 2008 and lost in the Democratic primary to Barack Obama. But anyhow, what kind of disappointed me about Edwards a little bit was I felt like he spent all his time in Washington using his position as a stepping stone to get a higher office, running for president or vice presidential candidate. And it never seemed like he was doing much for the citizens of North Carolina. So it seemed like we just had one senator. I think Elizabeth Dole might have been the senator at the time, but I was a little disappointed just in the fact that he seemed like he was more concerned about running for president than he was serving the citizens of North Carolina, which is a thing I think public officials need to be public servants and serve the people that they represent. And again, I had a little question about, John Edwards' priorities when he was up there. But anyhow, I didn't really have any, strong feelings about Edwards one way or the other. And I know had a platform of fighting poverty. I think that was one of his ideas. And there were some things in his background kind of contradicted that a little bit. But anyhow, I knew he'd run for president in 2008, but I didn't know much about his personal life or anything else that was going on with him. But then the way the case got started up, and I have to back up just a little bit from when we started the case, but it was August of 2008, and my wife and son and daughter and I were on a vacation trip up to Alaska. For anybody who's never been to Alaska, it's an incredible place to go. I highly recommend it. Just a beautiful country and wildlife. Part of our expedition up to Alaska was a cruise through Glacier Bay, Alaska, which is another just amazing place. We were on the cruise ship, and I guess we'd gone back to the room. This was early August of 2008. And we turned on the TV, and there was a news report, and it was Bob Woodruff of ABC News was interviewing John Edwards. And so, Edwards is our North Carolina senator, and we're like, well, let's take a minute or two and see what's going on here. And John Edwards gets on, and he admits that he had an extramarital affair with a woman named Riel Hunter, who had been a videographer on his campaign. And at the time, his wife, Elizabeth, John Edwards was married to Elizabeth Edwards, and Elizabeth had been battling cancer. And then her cancer had gone into remission, but then her cancer had returned in, I believe it was 2007, maybe. So John Edwards, I remember when he was making this bombshell admission about the extramarital affair, I remember him also saying something about he had this affair with Riel Hunter while his wife Elizabeth's cancer was in remission, that he had ended the affair. And, I remember he thinking to myself, that somehow he was trying to legitimize what he had done by saying that he did it while his wife's cancer was in remission rather than when she was battling.
That makes him, I guess, feel like a little better about his actions. I don't know.
I'm guessing so, but I remember that struck me as a little bit odd because I don't think that would make much difference to my wife. Having an extramarital affair would be a bad thing at any point of our marriage. There also one other point that he mentioned was Riel Hunter, the woman they had the extramarital affair with, had gotten pregnant and had a child. And Bob Woodruff asked him if it was his baby, which it turned out to be. But at that point, he denied. He said, nope, the child is not mine. Basically denied being the father of Riel Hunter's baby, which again, it's kind of like if you're going to make this major admission, why don't you come clean all the way instead of still trying to cover up certain parts of it? But my son and daughter and I kind of looked at each other and, had a little bit of a chuckle about it, not because there was anything funny about all this, but just it's kind of like, okay, well, there's another politician with feet of clay who has an extramarital affair and gets caught. And it just happens to be our senator from North Carolina, and so, we just turned off the TV and we went back out and looked for porpoises and whales and glaciers, calving and things like that on Glacier Bay and enjoyed the last couple of days of our vacation. And then a couple days later, I think this might have been a Thursday or Friday or whatever, when we saw the TV announcement. And, I had no idea that any of that was ever going to impact my life. But I walked into the office on Monday morning and Jim Sherrock comes up to me. Jim was a relief supervisor. And I think at the time he was the acting supervisor because we were between supervisors. And anyhow, I'm feeling pretty good about the vacation we just had and, in a good mood. And Jim comes up to me, he says, the U.S. Attorney's Office wants to open a investigation into John Edwards. And you're our public corruption guy. And as you know, Jerry, I did a previous podcast on the Jim Black, the case with the Speaker of the House. And we had cases on the governor of North Carolina and some other high-level public officials, and he's like, you're going to be the one who gets assigned to be the case agent on this. And I kind of looked at Jim, and I'm like, well, what's illegal about a politician having an extramarital affair? I mean, this sort of thing happens all the time, and I mean, it's certainly not acceptable conduct in my book, but it's not illegal. And Jim told me, he goes, well, there's some question about some illegal campaign money being used and some things like that. And so, as I say, I go from, looking at the TV announcement that John Edwards made on ABC News and not giving it a second thought to all of a sudden, being signed up as a case agent to do an investigation on John Edwards just a few days later. But anyhow, we go down to the U.S. Attorney's Office and met with the U.S. attorneys and special agent with IRS, Tim Riley. He's with the IRS Criminal Investigative Division, and he and I worked a lot of these public corruption cases together. And we discussed the case. And at some point, I'm not sure if it was that first meeting, but maybe a little bit later, an attorney from the Department of Justice named Justin Schur came down and met with us. And we talked about starting up the investigation. And so that's kind of how things got initiated. And Tim and I, always kind of took a pretty aggressive approach. It's like, okay, we've got this case coming in the door. Let's figure out, who do we need to go out and talk to start putting this case together. And where there'd been some talk about a guy named Andrew Young, who was Edwards' right-hand man. We'd been able to do a little bit of research, looking at news articles and that kind of thing. And so, we're kind of like, hey, let's go find Andrew Young and let's find some of these other people and get the ball rolling on this thing. And as soon as we said that, we get some pushback. It's like, no, wait a second, not so fast. And it turns out that the Department of Justice is very sensitive about doing anything that could interfere with an upcoming election. And like I say, this was August of 2008. And the election, I believe it was Barack Obama was running against, I believe it was John McCain at the time. And the election was in November of 2008. And they felt like, if we did anything overt, like doing interviews and the media got aware of it, that, that could somehow or another taint the election. Again, John Edwards was no longer a presidential candidate. He'd ended his campaign quite a while earlier. Anyhow, we were basically told to stand down until after the election. So weren't able to really do anything overtly up until after the election in November. But in the meantime, there was an analyst with the FBI up in headquarters in Washington who later became an agent, and he was able to do some research, and he found some suspicious activity reports. And, everybody knows what CTRs are, the currency transaction reports. If you bring $10,000 or more of cash into a bank, you have to file a CTR. And the suspicious activity reports are similar, and they're basically to catch things that wouldn't be caught by the CTR. For instance, if somebody brought in $9,999 of cash 5 times in a week, the suspicious activity report, they might file something like that to say, this isn't something that they needed to do a CTR for, but it's suspicious activity. But anyhow, he had found these suspicious activity reports that were showing these large payments going to, they ultimately ended up with Andrew Young, and they were coming from some different sources. I know there were a couple of very wealthy individuals that were basically sending money, which it turned out to be, for the benefit of keeping John Edwards' campaign alive by trying to keep the extramarital affair under wraps. And one of them was a man named Fred Barron, who was a trial attorney down in Texas. And Fred Barron, unfortunately, passed away not too long after the case started, and we were never able to interview him. But he had provided money to assist Andrew Young in what I'll get into, what he was having to do to basically try to keep the extramarital affair under wraps. And then there was also money coming from a wealthy woman named Rachel Mellon. She goes by Bunny Mellon, Rachel Bunny Mellon. She lived up in Upperville, Virginia, and I'll get into her interest in John Edwards in a little bit. But she was actually sending money through a source of interior decorator Brian Huffman, that was an interior decorator for her, who would then send the checks on to Andrew Young. And literally hundreds of thousands of dollars had been passing through, making its way to Andrew Young this way. So at that point, we had some smoke. We had records showing financial transactions, a lot of money moving around, but we didn't have any explanation as to what was going on, the reason for all these payments.
Let me interrupt you because I want to make sure that listeners who are not aware of suspicious activity reports understand that it's a requirement for banks and financial institutions to fill out. So they may not have been looking at John Edwards' accounts or his financial activities directly. They just saw activity that seemed strange. And so they just would have filled out these required reports and sent them in.
Yes, Jerry, you're absolutely right. And that's a good point, because I'm sure they had no clue, because John Edwards wasn't even part of the money trail or anything. And so they probably had no idea those reports would relate to a presidential candidate. But you're right there, as with the CTRs, if they see in activity, which in this case, these large amounts of money changing hands, I guess, raised red flags with them that necessitated them filling out the suspicious activity reports. But it was really the analyst up in Washington did a terrific job, finding this information out, because it really jump-started the investigation on the case. So they proved to be very helpful. And since our hands were tied a little bit as far as doing interviews, it was a good way to make some progress on the case until we could actually get out and start talking to some people.
Did you explain who Andrew Young was?
As a matter of fact, that's a great segue into what I was going to talk about next, Jerry, which was, if it wasn't the day after the election, it was maybe a couple days after the election. And Tim Riley and I drive out to try to find Andrew Young. And we had heard that, he was building this big house, with some of the money that was coming into him. And it was outside of Chapel Hill. John Edwards lived in Chapel Hill as well. So He was, I think part of it was to be close to John Edwards, but we go out to try to find Andrew Young, and we're driving out. It's way out in the woods. We were driving down these dirt roads, and we find this house that it was pretty far along, but you could tell it was still a little bit under construction, and big house. And we go up and knock on the door because that's supposed to be Andrew Young's residence. And we knock on the door, no answer. We knock on the door again, no answer. And Tim Riley decides, he's not here. So he starts walking to the car. And so I said, well, hang on, let me try something. And I knocked on the door and I yelled, Andrew, FBI, we need to talk to you. And all of a sudden I hear some movement inside the house, and Andrew comes to the door and he says, hello to us. And he says, boy, I'm glad it was you guys. I thought you were the press. I guess the press had been hounding him, over this John Edwards case. And we'll kind of get into the National Enquirer's investigation into this and how that was all playing out. But anyhow, we told Andrew that we wanted to talk with him about the situation with John Edwards. And he had actually had kind of a falling out with John Edwards. And so he was willing to talk to us. He wasn't, he wouldn't talk to us that particular day because he wanted to get an attorney and consult with an attorney. But we were able to get him in for an interview right away. And Jerry, I don't know what the longest interview report you've ever done, but Andrew Young ended up writing a book about his experiences with John Edwards. I think my interview report read pretty much like his book from start to finish. It was, I think, 33 pages long, and he, covered everything kind of from start to finish. And like you had asked about Andrew's background, I'll go through pretty much what he said in the report because this kind of lays the case out pretty well. Andrew Young had gone to UNC and gotten a degree in political science in 1992. He'd gone to Wake Forest Law School and graduated there in 1995. I don't think he ever took the bar or actually became licensed as an attorney, but he was at a continuing legal education event, and John Edwards was one of the speakers there. He heard John Edwards speak, and he was just so enamored with Edwards. He just thought Edwards was so charismatic, and he decided basically immediately, he determined that this guy is going to be president of the United States one day and that he wanted to work for him. And so Andrew basically did everything he could to kind of get involved with John Edwards. He joined his campaign and did some work for the campaign. And when John Edwards was elected in 1998 to the U.S. Senate, he joined John Edwards' staff. The first position I think he had was as an area director somewhere in North Carolina, but he would do everything he possibly could to ingratiate himself to John Edwards. And if John Edwards came in, Andrew would pick him up at the airport, he'd drive him around, he'd get him his meals, he'd do basically anything that John Edwards needed, and started to establish a good friendship relationship with John Edwards. And then in 2002, John Edwards had him come to Washington to basically be his right-hand man. And his job, I think this is a quote that Andrew gave us, that his job was to take care of John Edwards and make his life easy. And so he was just kind of like John Edwards' personal servant or whatever.
Personal assistant, like the stars and celebrities have.
Right. And he would get John Edwards his breakfast every day. He'd clean his house. He'd make sure his cars were running. He would get John Edwards would read. John Edwards didn't use a computer, apparently, but he would read 3 newspapers every day. And Andrew Young would have to go get these 3 newspapers, and he had to cut the ads out of the newspapers before he could give them to John Edwards to read. That was just one of the things that John Edwards required him to do. And so basically, Andrew Young just hitched himself to John Edwards' wagon and was going to follow John Edwards to the ends of the earth. You'll see a lot of really reprehensible things that John Edwards asked him to do over the course of working for him. But he did describe, working for Edwards and Elizabeth Edwards as well. He said they were high maintenance people, and it was something that wasn't always the easiest job in the world to be doing all this grunt work for John Edwards. And this is another kind of semi-quote. I remember him saying attaching himself to John Edwards was his best chance for success in life. And so it was his motivation, and it almost worked, because if John Edwards had become the president of the United States, which I'll probably talk about a little bit later, he wasn't that far away from that happening, and Andrew would have undoubtedly had a high level position in his administration and probably been set for life. So, he didn't miss the mark by a lot, in what he was trying to do. But as I'll explain, it all really went south in a bad way for him. But anyhow, he was doing his best to be as close to John Edwards as he could. And then in 2003, John Edwards decided to run for president. And as I say, he hadn't even finished out his first Senate term, but, he was planning on being the president. And he ended up losing the election. But John Kerry, again, asked him to be his running mate. So he was involved in the presidential election as a vice presidential candidate. And then they ultimately lost to George Bush and Dick Cheney in the election. But John Edwards was planning to run again in 2008. Like I say, he had this ambition of being president and wasn't going to let anything stop him. And so Andrew Young, continuing on with, again, these are the things Andrew Young told us in the interview, but he told us that John Edwards met Riel Hunter, the woman who would become his mistress, in February of 2006. And John Edwards was up at the Regency Hotel in New York. And apparently she came up to him and they ended up running into each other. And she told him, this line is a quote, "You're so hot." And John Edwards had her come up to the room with him. They slept together that night. And then they basically had an affair that continued on from there, according to Andrew Young. And then we actually met Riel ourselves when she came to testify for the grand jury, which I'll probably talk about too. But Andrew Young described Riel that she was just kind of a flaky person. She had a spiritual advisor that advised her on different ways to live her life, and a lot of eccentricities, kind of marched the beat of her own drummer. But as Andrew said, she just connected with John Edwards in a way that worked for them. As I say, they met in February 2006, and in June 2006, John Edwards had some organizations that he had set up that were kind of basically prepping him up to run for office in 2008. And Riel Hunter started this company that she called Midline Groove Productions. And Edwards' organization hired her to do what they called webisodes, which were things where she was videotaping Edwards in different things he was doing in his life, trying to basically show the true John Edwards and the side of him that people didn't see, when he was a political candidate, and show what a good guy he was.
But this was a company that she did not create until after she met him. She wasn't doing this before.
Right, right. Jerry, I'll tell you, Riel was basically homeless when she met John Edwards. And I'll talk about when we actually went to find her to serve her with a grand jury subpoena, and she was living with a friend. She didn't even have a place to live. But when she got together with John Edwards, her life definitely changed in a positive way there.
So in a sense, she was just like Andrew Young. She was hoping to attach herself to somebody who seemed to have a very promising career and projected rise in society.
I tell you what, Jerry, I would agree with you to that to an extent. Andrew was definitely, looking to ride John Edwards' coattails as high as he could go. Riel was a little different. I mean, I truly think, she loved John Edwards and was attracted to him. And I think it was more than just, this guy's a meal ticket. Although when she had the child, that basically put her in a position where she kind of had some leverage to get financial compensation to take care of the child, that sort of thing. So it did work out that way for her. But I think her interests were a little more, deeper, spiritually so connected than just looking for money. She's an interesting person. And just recently, Jake Tapper did a special on his scandals in America, and he interviewed Riel. And if you watch that interview, you'll just kind of understand what I'm saying. She's a different, interesting kind of person. And so, again, she and John Edwards just somehow had a connection that worked. So Riel was hired on by the company, and she was getting payments there that, again, enabled her to have some financial income coming in that she didn't have before. So she's working with the campaign, and a lot of the staffers that we interviewed told us that they knew what was going on. They were flirting with each other, and it was really no secret. Nobody stepped in and stopped it, I guess, would be a good way of describing it. But in December of 2006, John Edwards he made an announcement that he was going to run for president of the United States in the 2008 election. And he's doing that while he's still having the affair with Riel Hunter. Then, shortly after that, in March of 2007, Elizabeth Edwards announced that her cancer had come back. She had had cancer and it was fortunately had gone into remission, but then the cancer had come back in 2007 and basically was incurable. It ended up ultimately taking her life. So John Edwards is running for president. He's got a wife that's battling cancer, and then he's having this extramarital affair with Riel Hunter, and he's trying to keep that quiet so he can run for president. In May of 2007, Riel Hunter starts having symptoms that indicate that she may be pregnant. And so now they end up with Riel pregnant with John Edwards' baby, and they need to do a couple of things. They need to basically keep Riel Hunter out of sight as she's becoming more and more pregnant so John Edwards can continue to run for the presidency of the United States. And then they also have to find a way to pay her expenses because she's got to live somewhere and they've got to keep her out of sight. John Edwards, he'd made a lot of money as a trial attorney, so he had plenty of wealth. But the problem was Elizabeth Edwards, his wife, controlled the finances and monitored all the money. And if John Edwards was spending money on something that she didn't know what it was, she'd call him out on it. And so John Edwards didn't really have any control over the money. And so John Edwards tells Andrew Young, it's like, you've got to find someone who can pay Riel's expenses for us. It just so happens there was this billionaire woman named Bunny Mellon who lived up in Upperville, Virginia. I really liked Ms. Bunny. She was just a really interesting person, but she had been really close friends with the Kennedys. And Jackie Kennedy had actually had her design the Rose Garden in the White House. She was the godmother of Caroline Kennedy and JFK Jr. And Bunny thought that John Edwards reminded her a lot of John F. Kennedy.
In more ways than she knew.
Exactly. I get where you're coming from there. I tell you, Joe, you'll be interested to hear what Bunny's take on men having extramarital affairs is, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I actually was able to kind of develop a friendship with her over the time because we interviewed her several times, and for some reason she liked me, and so I ended up calling her Ms. Bunny. So if I refer to her as Ms. Bunny, that's why. But she wanted to help John Edwards, to help to get him elected president, and she, like most people, didn't really understand the sophistication of the campaign finance laws. She didn't realize that there were restrictions on how much money you could give and things like that. And as a lot of people don't understand that. So that's no criticism of her. She had ended up contacting John Edwards' campaign, and she contacted them because, and Jerry, I don't know if you remember this, but there was some flack that John Edwards was receiving at one point about getting haircuts that cost $400 and paying for them out of his campaign. Back then, I guess a $400 haircut was viewed as pretty excessive, maybe not so much anymore.
Oh, I think so. Still, it would be.
Well, I was getting my hair cut at Supercuts for like the $5 special or whatever. So $400 seemed like a lot to me. But it reminded me of one of the staffers we interviewed that worked for John Edwards. It was kind of an interesting contradiction, but John Edwards was running on this platform of there's two Americas, and one is the rich people, and then you got the poor people that are in poverty. And he was trying to fight to make it so he could end poverty and have everybody, have enough wealth to be able to live a good life. But the staffer told me when he was running, there were these, she called them the 3 H's. And they were the haircuts, the house, and the hedge fund. The $400 haircuts, obviously was something that Edwards got a lot of flack over. And then he and Elizabeth had built, I think it was a 30,000 square foot house outside of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, biggest house in the Orange County, North Carolina. And they were living in this palatial mansion. And then he'd made some money in a hedge fund, and I can't remember all the details, but there was some kind of controversy about that. And so, here's a guy who's talking about disparity of income by people in the United States and how it's unfair, but he's getting $400 haircuts, living in the biggest house in Orange County and making money off of a hedge fund. So it kind of flew in the face of what his platform was. But Bunny Mellon called up to basically complain that she didn't think it was fair that John Edwards was getting criticized for getting $400 haircuts. She was basically kind of like, and Bunny, when we learned more about her, she actually had a private jet, and she used to fly to Paris to get her hair done there in Paris. And so
Yeah, that's nothing to her.
that probably sounded like my $5 supercuts to her. But she basically, I think, was like, if John Edwards wants to get $400 haircuts, I will pay for the haircuts, because he deserves to have his hair cut the way that he should. And she had contacted the campaign, and John Edwards and Andrew Young get together and decide that she could be the person that could basically pay for Riel Hunter's expenses to keep her in a home and fed and everything while they're trying to keep her out of sight so John Edwards can run for president. There was some talk about Elizabeth's not going to live that much longer, and when she passes away and John Edwards gets control of his finances again, he can take over, but we need a stopgap to cover Riel's expenses until something happens to Elizabeth, some way to compensate Riel without Elizabeth finding out about it. And they were trying, again, to hide the affair from Elizabeth. So they had figured out that Bunny Mellon could be the source of funds to maintain Riel and keep her out of sight while she was pregnant and while John Edwards was running for president. And Bunny Mellon apparently committed to give them like $900,000. And I think she ultimately paid him about $725,000 through this system that they had. John Edwards would go visit Bunny Mellon to kind of grease the skids to get her to, when they needed money, and then she'd make a payment. But Bunny Mellon had an attorney that was kind of watching over her finances. And this guy's name was Alex Forger. Forger was watching how Ms. Bunny spent her money. And so she had to come up with some way to basically keep Alex Forger from suspecting that she was giving money to John Edwards. And she had already donated some money to John Edwards' causes. And Alex Forger had been like, this is enough. You've already given enough. She and her friend, Brian Huffman, her interior decorator friend, had concocted this scheme where she would pretend, they called it the furniture business. And both of them kind of got a little bit of a laugh out of that because they would pretend that she was purchasing furniture from Brian Huffman, and she'd write a check, and it would be for something like cabinets or table and chairs or something like that. And it'd be for $100,000, and she'd make it out to Brian Huffman, put the notation in for antique furniture or something like that. And she'd send the check to Brian Huffman, and then Brian Huffman would endorse the check. And this is what I think triggered some of these suspicious activity reports. But he would endorse the check, and then he would send it to Andrew Young, and then Andrew Young would give the check to his wife. His wife's name was Sherry Young, but she had an account in her maiden name, Sherry Pfister, and then she would deposit the check, and then they'd use the money to pay Riel's expenses, and they were trying to basically keep Alex Forger from suspecting where these payments were going. So they're doing this to get money, and again, they got about $725,000, I believe, from Ms. Bunny. And to kind of keep going. And this, again, is Andrew Young laying all this out. And as you can tell, it kind of reads like his book. But in about September of 2007, the National Enquirer, they got wind of the fact that John Edwards was having an extramarital affair with Riel Hunter. Once again, John Edwards goes to Andrew Young, and he's like, look, you got to take care of this for me. And so Andrew Young ends up having Riel Hunter move in with he and his wife. And they have, I think, 3 children. And so they ended up, having Riel Hunter living with them. And as I say, she's a little bit of a strange type. I mean, she marches to a different drummer. She's living with them, and that's not working out real well. And then also, Andrew told us that sometimes John Edwards would want to come over and have sex with Riel. And so the family would have to leave the house, and so they could do what they were going to do.
This seems way beyond the responsibilities of a personal assistant.
It does. and just wait, because it gets worse. Andrew kind of described it as they were going through hell. And so, and Sherry, was, I mean, you can imagine what his wife was like. But this Fred Barron, the trial attorney that he thought John Edwards, he wanted a trial attorney like John Edwards to be in the White House, and he thought John Edwards could win. So he was sending money to Andrew Young along with the money, the Bunny Mellon money. But Fred Barron passed away, and then that money source dried up. So they were, again, reliant on Bunny Mellon for money. But Andrew and Sherry were building At the time, they were building this house, the one that we went and found him at in Chapel Hill. So he's, getting money and using some of that for his house and trying to take care of that. The National Enquirer, they apparently had some source that was giving them information, and the source had told them that Rielle Hunter was pregnant. And so they're trying to get a photo of Rielle Hunter. And so they literally, in November of 2007, they staked out every OBGYN location in Cary, North Carolina. And they got a hit on one where Rielle came out. They got a picture of her pregnant. So they're making life miserable for John Edwards, by putting out these stories that, he's having this extramarital affair and the woman's pregnant. So, Jerry, I told you it was going to get worse. Here it comes. John Edwards then tells Andrew Young he needs him to take the hit. The hit is John Edwards wanted Andrew Young to say that he was the father of Rielle Hunter's baby. He says, no offense, Andrew, but nobody really cares about you. If you take the hit, it's a one-day story. If I take the hit, everything we've worked for is gone and it's all down the drain. He wants Andrew Young to basically say he was having an extramarital affair with Rielle Hunter and put out an announcement to that effect, and it's his child. And so Andrew tells us he talked to Sherry, his wife, and they had kind of a knockdown, drag-out fight.
I would think so.
And we interviewed Sherry Young, and of course, we asked her the question, are you kidding me? How in the world would you allow your husband to do this? And it was basically that they were just in so deep with John Edwards and so reliant on him pretty much for their livelihood that they just decided they had to do it. So in December of 2007, they put out these statements basically saying 2 of my staffers had an extramarital affair, and Andrew and Rielle make statements that, they had this extramarital affair and that Andrew's the father of her baby. All the other stuff Andrew had to do probably paled in comparison to having to basically say he was the father of Rielle Hunter's child for the whole nation to see and to humiliate his wife. They continue trying to move Rielle around, and they go from Aspen, Colorado. Fred Barron had a place in Aspen, then he needed it for some other people. They moved to San Diego. They moved to Santa Barbara. Apparently, Sherry Young was having to homeschool their children while they were doing all this moving around to try to keep Rielle out of sight. And at the time, John Edwards is being asked about this extramarital affair, and he's denying it, every time, and he'll say things like, I'm not even going to answer that question. That's a ridiculous question, and I'm not even going to dignify it with a response. And John Edwards has basically told Andrew, it's like, your job in all this is to control Rielle, just keep that situation under control. In February 2008, Rielle Hunter has her baby. Now it's not just Rielle, but she has her baby. And John Edwards, early 2008, he had been running for president against Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton for the Democratic nomination. I think people thought he had a good chance of winning the nomination, but it turned out Barack Obama won, I believe, the Iowa caucuses, and Edwards finished third, I think, in both Iowa and New Hampshire. And he ended up having to basically shut down his campaign. And, as we know, Barack Obama went on and won the Democratic nomination and won the presidential election. But John Edwards was still hoping to get chosen either to be like a vice president, or he also had his sights on the attorney general position. So he's still trying to keep those hopes alive. And so, again, they're still trying to keep Rielle Hunter out of sight and keep the press from being able to know that she's his mistress and that this child is his child. But, this goes on. And in July of 2008, John Edwards gets busted. Rielle is at the Beverly Hills Hilton out in California with her baby. And John Edwards is going, I guess, to visit them. I think it might have been the first time for him to see the child. But again, the National Enquirer somehow got wind of the fact that he was going to be there and staked out the hotel and managed to, I guess they got a kind of blurry picture of him and the child. And then Edwards came out and the reporters confronted him, and he apparently ran back in the building and ran in the bathroom, and they had to get security to escort him out of the bathroom. It was, okay, this charade that you've been doing is over. It's, you've been caught. And so that, like I say, that was in July of 2008. And then the news release with Bob Woodruff that I told you about that got everything started with my involvement in the case was August, where he made this announcement that he had an extramarital affair. He said the affair was over. claimed the child was not his, but he made this admission of the extramarital affair. That takes us through everything Andrew Young told us. And so we had a pretty good idea of kind of how everything had gone down. And as I say, Andrew Young ended up writing a book. Some other people that we wanted to talk to, obviously, we wanted to talk to Bunny Mellon. So we went up to her place in Upperville, Virginia. Sweet lady. She was 98 years old at the time. She lived to be 104, probably worth $1 billion. She told us that John Edwards reminded her of JFK, and she was really close to the Kennedy family, and she felt like the country needed another John F. Kennedy, and that was her motivation to help John Edwards. And she told us how the money had flowed through her interior decorator, Brian Huffman. And she said Brian, a really colorful character, nice guy that we interviewed him as well. Bunny had established this Episcopal church up in Upperville, Virginia. And somehow Brian had just been passing through and decided to attend church there. And he liked it so well, he wrote Ms. Bunny a note telling him how much he enjoyed going to church at this church that she had established. And she invited him to come up for a visit. And he came up and visited. And somehow they got to talking about John Edwards. And Brian asked her if she knew John Edwards, and she said she did not. And Brian's sister had actually gone to law school with Andrew Young at Wake Forest. And so Brian was able to kind of set up a meeting. He actually brought John Edwards up to meet Ms. Bunny. Over the course of talking with Ms. Bunny several times, she seemed to take a liking to me, and she'd call me sometimes. We actually kind of developed a little bit of a friendship, and she actually sent me a Christmas card a time or two. And I think she was kind of amused by all this business with the FBI being involved and everything. And I remember her telling me she had had dinner or lunch or something with Caroline Kennedy over the weekend. And she had told her about her friend in the FBI that she was just, thought this was, I think she kind of got a kick out of what was going on, and, having the FBI up interviewing her. But anyhow, again, she felt like John Edwards would make a good president and wanted to help him. And again, really didn't have an understanding of campaign finance laws, and, didn't know that you couldn't just give somebody as much money as you wanted to.
So she thought she was making an investment in the future.
They didn't tell her what the money was for.
I would think not.
I'll get to that in a minute. You'll be kind of surprised at her reaction, but she wanted to help John Edwards. John Edwards had this poverty center, and I know I think, may have thought some of the money was going to the poverty center. The whole campaign finance thing, I think, was just something that she just didn't really know that much about.
How much money did they get just from her?
Well, she had given a good sum of money to some of these organizations that John Edwards had set up, and Alex Forger had seen those donations she'd made and basically told her, no more, you've given enough to John Edwards. And so that's when they started up this furniture business way to kind of do an end around Alex Forger. And she got, and I can tell you, the sum total is like $725,000. Now, this is just checks that I'm telling you about right now. There could have been other payments, but it was like she had one check for tables that she wrote to Brian Huffman for $10,000. She had one for chairs for $65,000, and there were like antique Charleston tables for $100,000, and there was like a hunt board, I guess, that was $150,000. It's like she was paying. I don't exactly know what a hunt board is, but $150,000 seems like a lot for a piece of furniture. But anyhow, altogether, the checks that we were aware of that came through this furniture business thing were about $725,000.
That's a lot of money just to be able to house a pregnant mistress.
They were moving all around the country, and they were, having to stay in different places. And quite frankly, and this came out at the trial where, Andrew Young was a really important witness, obviously, for the government, as you could tell by, when I went through everything that he told us. But he had also gotten some money for himself that he had used for their house that they were building. He had a bunch of dental work done and just, a lot of personal expenditure. I guess think of it this way, Jerry. You've got Andrew Young, his wife, their 3 children, Riel Hunter, then Riel Hunter with her baby. And you're not just staying in one place. You're kind of moving around to different places, and costs can add up. I agree with you. That seems like a lot of money, but I'm sure they were burning through money pretty quickly as well. But Bunny didn't really know what her money was going for. But we asked her the question. We said, what would you think if we told you the money was going to support John Edwards' mistress? And her reaction to that, she said it doesn't bother her that he was having an extramarital affair. she basically said all men have extramarital affairs. And I think she even said something to us like, and if you're not, there's something wrong with you or something like that. And I know a couple of us were kind of looking across the room at each other like, okay, that's an interesting comment for you to make. But anyhow, she said that she would not have been happy. She would not have paid the money herself to Riel Hunter, and she wouldn't have, and I think her words were, aided and abetted his relationship with Riel Hunter. One thing I thought of when we were doing this case is, we were trying to figure out if we were going to bring charges, what we could charge him with. And I remember thinking to some extent, could we make a fraud case here? Well, was Ms. Bunny defrauded by Andrew Young and John Edwards?
Yeah, I was thinking that myself since, I come from that economic crime background. She didn't know what she was giving the money for, so she gave it, but she gave it due to deception.
Exactly. And Ms. Bunny did not know about Riel or the child until after she'd written all the checks. That was something that came out later. There were a few issues. I know Bunny Mellon probably wouldn't have been a very good victim witness or whatever. She, first of all, like I say, she was almost 100 years old and she loved John Edwards. And, I don't know that we would have been able to get cooperation out of her to testify against John. And as it turned out, she did not testify at the trial. We just kind of made the decision, because of her age and everything, not to call her as a witness. But like you, the thought of a fraud case did cross my mind. Can't we turn this into a mail fraud or a fraud by wire or something like that? So it turned out that the prosecutors didn't consider that to be a viable option. And I know that, there were a lot of potential problems with that. Moving on in the investigation, we interviewed Sherry Young, Andrew's wife, and you can imagine what that interview was like. Your husband's told the whole world that he had an extramarital affair and was the father of a child that John Edwards was responsible for. And, needless to say, she did not have much love lost for John Edwards, and, having her husband lie to say he was the father of someone else's baby. And, Riel Hunter was a kind of thorn in her side as well, with her eccentricities and all that. But she basically is like, we were in so deep with this, and again, just dependent on John Edwards for their livelihood. John Edwards always made sure that Andrew Young had a job and he had health insurance. And I know some of Andrew's and Sherry's children had some health issues. It was really important to him to keep that insurance. And so, I think that might have been a little bit of a motivation as well, that, if we just break ties away from John Edwards, what are you going to do? What's our health insurance going to be? And how are we going to take care of our kids? And so people do things for all kinds of crazy motivations. Jerry, I'm sure you've seen a lot of people that you shake your head, but they've got their reasons for doing whatever they did, and they seem logical to them. We also interviewed Brian Huffman, a very colorful character, just really a delightful person to talk to. And he was an interesting character because I told you he met Bunny Mellon by going up and visiting her church. And he developed this really close friendship with her. And he lived down in Monroe, North Carolina. But just about every night, he would call Ms. Bunny and talk to her on the phone, and they'd just sit there and they'd talk about things. And, he didn't want anything from her, which is probably refreshing, because when you have that much money, everybody kind of wants a piece of you. But, he was just a good guy and liked Ms. Bunny, and, they would talk together on the phone. And they came up, he confirmed about this furniture business.
So what did he think that the money was being used for?
It's been so long ago. I'm trying to remember. I don't know that he necessarily knew the money was going to pay for Riel's expenses. He was a good guy and certainly not the kind of person that would take advantage of Bunny Mellon, but he knew that Bunny Mellon wanted to help John Edwards and wanted to help become president. And so he was helping to facilitate the money transfer. But I would have to go back and do some research on that to find out for sure, because I don't remember. One thing that I thought he was very smart on is I think they wanted him to cash the checks and like give the money over to Andrew Young, but he refused to do that. He didn't want it to look like, okay, I cashed the checks, then, where's the money go from there? You lose the paper trail, and, he wouldn't have been able to show, where the money actually went. And so, he would endorse the checks over to Andrew Young, and then Andrew Young would give them to his wife and she would negotiate the checks. Part of this chain that was used to funnel the money from Bunny Mellon to Andrew Young for the point of keeping Riel Hunter under wraps and out of sight and trying to allow John Edwards to continue his pursuit of the presidency of the United States without having, this kind of deep, dark secret come to light. We had worked on this case for a year or so, I think, and there was a point where the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I assume DOJ, had basically decided that they really couldn't prosecute John Edwards for, what had gone on, that they just didn't have a solid legal theory to go on. And so for a period of time, the case kind of shut down, and we just weren't even doing anything with it. It seemed like maybe a year went by without us really working on the case because there was this thought that, they just didn't know quite how to bring charges against John Edwards. And so the case kind of got put on my back burner. And I think, as I told you, we had cases at the time. I think we had a case on the governor of North Carolina, Mike Easley. He ended up being the first North Carolina governor to ever plead guilty to a felony. So we were working on that case and we had an undercover operation on another corruption case. And so I didn't, miss working on the Edwards case because I had plenty of other things to do.
Let's stop and talk about this a little bit because I think this is something where people on the outside get confused. And that is about the FBI's responsibility in what will be charged, how the FBI does the investigation, and then decisions are made about if there are any chargeable offenses, the prosecutorial merit of the case. So why don't you talk about that a little bit to give people a better understanding of why you were just able to move on?
That's a very good point, Jerry, because I think you're right. A lot of people don't understand how it works. And I know when I talk to people about what the FBI's role is I tell them basically our job is to find the truth. It's like our job's not to make somebody look guilty who's not guilty or make somebody look innocent who's not. Our job is to find the truth of how whatever happened, and take that information to the prosecuting attorney, whether it's U.S. attorney or district attorney, somebody who's the prosecutor. And then they weigh that evidence and they decide whether charges are filed or not. The FBI certainly, as you've probably done, if you have a case that's really strong and you feel like the person that committed the crime is guilty and egregious things, you might advocate that, I think this is a strong case and, I hope you'll consider bringing charges and maybe, even suggest if there were money transfers via wire transfers or whatever. So we've got a wire fraud. So those would be counts we could consider or whatever. But the final decision is the U.S. Attorney's Office, the prosecuting attorneys, and the FBI doesn't have any. I mean, if the U.S. Attorney's Office says we're not going to prosecute the case, there's really pretty much nothing the FBI can do. I mean, we can do the most extensive investigation in the world, but the U.S. Attorney's Office has the final say so. I never had a problem with that. I mean, I felt like, I didn't really want to play judge or jury or having to make some of those calls like that. My job was to find out what happened, find out the truth, and then bring the case to the prosecutor. Occasionally, there'd be one where you knew that this person, the victims, were really seriously harmed and the criminal had done things that were horrible. And you would advocate for a prosecution. Or there were a couple of times I know where I'm like, I don't think this person needs to be charged. I don't think that's the appropriate remedy here. So you might give your opinion. But again, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Department of Justice have the final say so. So like in this case, when they kind of backed off a little bit, it was like, well, there's no point in investigating this case anymore if the U.S. Attorney's Office has decided and DOJ has decided that they're not going to prosecute it. So let's move on to other cases that we've got because there's always more work to do, Jerry. As you know, there's always 100 more cases that could be worked. And so you never run out of work with the FBI. And then kind of out of the blue, I'm not quite sure what had happened, but I get this message that there's an attorney from the Department of Justice, Justin Scher, the person that we talked to at the beginning of the case. He was going to come down to North Carolina. He wanted to have a meeting about the John Edwards case and try to talk about, what we wanted to do with that particular case. And I'll say this, when we were talking to Justin Scher, we're having this conversation, we're kind of going back and forth, and I don't have any animosity or anything towards John Edwards. I've, met him when he was arrested, and he's a nice, likable person, so this isn't coming from there. But I felt like the absurdity of everything we saw just required something to be done in this situation. And I remember telling Justin and the other attorneys something to the effect, if a couple of people can give hundreds of thousands of dollars to keep the mistress of a political candidate who's running for president and her child out of sight, which was clearly done to influence basically benefit the person's candidacy and influence how the person's perceived to the voters, something had to be illegal about that. And if it wasn't illegal, our campaign finance laws needed to be changed to make it illegal. And I remember Justin kind of looked at me and he smiled and he goes, "If we prosecute this case, do you want to give the closing argument?" And I said, "Yes, sir. I'll be glad to do it," because that's kind of my closing argument in all this is that, something needed to be done. Even if determination was that we don't have any laws that we can prosecute them under, then Congress needs to legislate some laws to outlaw, what was done here, where all this money can be transferred in that, again, is for the purpose of influencing the election. Because, John Edwards has this deep, dark secret that he's going to try to hide. You can imagine the ramifications, if he'd been elected and some of the things that could have happened if he'd been elected without anybody knowing about this, and then somebody finds out about it and uses it to blackmail him or whatever. There's, that's something that the public should have known, and the fact that all this money was being used to cover it up.
And the fact that they were going so far out of their way, moving around and to state, and just an attempt to hide her and the baby is evidence of that.
Yeah, it was a very elaborate cover up and effort to cover up what was going on. So you're exactly right there. But anyhow, somehow, I'm not sure what motivated Justin, to go back to DOJ, but the case got kind of reinvigorated, and they decided, okay, let's see if we can pursue this and prosecute the case if we get the evidence that we need. And so Jerry, I know I've been talking a while, so I'll try to kind of streamline this a little bit, but we basically had to go back and re-interview a bunch of the people because we had some new attorneys that joined the case. And so we interviewed, Andrew Young again, Brian Huffman again, Bunny Mellon again. We interviewed a bunch of John Edwards staffers, some of whom were working for President Obama in the White House. We actually went to the West Wing of the White House and interviewed some people there. I think David Axelrod was one of them, maybe Jennifer Palmieri. But there was an agent in the WFO office named Jay Greenberg, who I think I saw now that he's some kind of, executive director or something of the FBI. He had a contact with the White House counsel and was able to set some of this up. So we're over at the White House in the West Wing, doing interviews of these people that had worked for John Edwards that were now working for President Obama. One of the things we did, we subpoenaed Riel Hunter to come and testify before the grand jury. Riel Hunter, like I say, she didn't even have a place to live. And so we figured out that she was living with a friend of hers up in East Orange, New Jersey. Tim Riley and I both went up there, and we went to the address and knocked on the door. Sure enough, he was living with a woman named Mimi Hockman. Mimi comes to the door. We told her we were looking for Riel Hunter, and there's Riel standing in her living room holding her baby. And so we found Riel, and we issued her a subpoena to come down to testify before the grand jury in North Carolina. And so Riel flew down to Raleigh for the grand jury, and it was another kind of interesting twist to this. As I say, Riel, was pretty much homeless, staying with her friend, Mimi Hockland, because she didn't have a place to live. And we put her up in the embassy suites, and she didn't like the accommodations, so we had to move her to another hotel. It was okay for her. And then somehow the media got wind of what we were doing. So we ended up taking her down to the federal courthouse, and there were all these cameras and everything, taking everybody's picture, us walking Riel into the courthouse. We went in the back entrance, but still, they were all over, and, she was walking in with her attorney and her baby.
I think you shared the photo with me.
Right.
So I'll put that in the show notes for this episode. But yeah, it's a pretty dramatic photo.
I think that photo, or one of those photos, ended up on the cover of the National Enquirer, if you can believe it. And I got a copy of that, and I saved it for Tim Riley when we did his going away. It's like, I'm gonna bring this out, have this framed, and bring this out at your retirement to show one of the greatest moments of your career, Tim, or whatever, when you were on the cover of the National Enquirer. That was an interesting day. We take Riel in and take her upstairs to where the grand jury is, and Riel did not want to be apart from her baby. I don't have any doubts from Riel that she's a good mother and she had her best interest of her baby at heart. I don't know what she was necessarily thinking, but she did not want to leave her baby. She wanted to take her baby in the grand jury room. And so there was this kind of altercation between the attorneys about, whether she could take the baby with her to testify. And ultimately, it was decided she agreed to leave the baby with me and Tim in the witness room outside the grand jury. And so we're basically babysitting her child while she testifies in the grand jury. And the baby started to cry, and we're like, uh-oh, she's going to hear this, and she's going to come running out of the grand jury room. So quickly, we had Michelle Scott with us, the witness coordinator for the U.S. Attorney's Office. So we ran her upstairs and to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and they had a TV in one of their conference rooms, and we were able to put some cartoons on and, keep the baby happy, while she was watching cartoons and everything. But apparently, Riel, when she got done testifying, she came out of the grand jury room and her baby wasn't there, and she was not happy about that. But anyhow, by the time she got upstairs to where we were, saw her baby was okay. I think she was fine with that. But anyhow, that was something that probably a lot of agents, your job description is broad and you have to do a lot of things, but babysitting a grand jury witness's child probably isn't something that a lot of agents, figured would be a part of their job description.
But it was yours on that day.
Fortunately, she was able to testify and we got her back together with her child and everything worked out. We also had Bunny Mellon. Some of her family came down, her son and her grandson and his wife. And that was another one where, the press knew that they were coming. They flew down in Bunny's private plane and landed in the RDU airport. So I went out and picked them up, and there were all these helicopters and stuff flying around, and they couldn't fly into the airspace, certain airspace at the airport. So they had to kind of stay out on the periphery. And I remember we drove under this. I don't know if you've ever been in that part of the airport, Jerry, but there's this tunnel that kind of goes under the runway. And so we drove under there and we sat there for a little bit and then, let a little bit of time go by and then drove out and the helicopters were gone. The air traffic controllers probably told them they had to leave or whatever. And so, but I remember Bunny's family, thought this was so cool, riding with the FBI and evading the helicopters. But anyhow, they came down and testified before the grand jury, and we worked up the case, put everything together, and the DOJ and the U.S. Attorney's Office, obviously, they had some really intense discussions figuring out what to do with this case. And I'm trying to think, I don't think I had a lot to do with those discussions because, like, as you say, it became something where I might have flown up to Washington for something on the case on one of those, but I know the U.S. Attorney's Office and DOJ, really kind of agonized over what to do, but they eventually decided to charge John Edwards with, I thought it was a unique legal theory. It was basically a conspiracy to violate the campaign finance laws and receiving illegal campaign contributions and making false statements to the Federal Election Commission. And so I'll say this, I commend the Department of Justice for going forward on this case because it was a tough case. And I think everybody knew it, that, it was something that was kind of a new, unique theory that hadn't been tried before, but they decided to go forward and indict John Edwards. And so a lot of the payments that actually checks have been negotiated in Durham, North Carolina, which is in the Middle District. And we'd been doing all our grand jury work in the Eastern District. So we had to basically represent the case to the Middle District of North Carolina. And John Edwards was indicted. Another interesting thing about the case, when John Edwards was arrested, and I think I sent you a picture of this, Jerry, he smiled for his mugshot. He had this big grin on his face.
Yeah, it's a very disturbing mugshot when you're used to seeing mugshots of people who are not happy that they've been arrested.
Right. I've arrested hundreds of people in my career, and I think he's the only one that ever smiled for his mugshot. And then Greg Gary, another agent in the office, Greg and I were processing him, and I think we were getting the DNA swab or whatever from him. It was like he was a politician. He was shaking our hands. He was, asking me questions. He's like, Chuck, it's good to meet you. Do you have children? How old are they? Do they, basically it was almost like he was at a political event, and I kind of, I appreciate you being nice, but, do you realize you've just been arrested? You're not fundraising for your campaign. But anyhow, I think I said something to him like, boy, you ask a lot of questions. And he said something like, oh, I'm sorry. Am I not supposed to say anything? But he was very gregarious during the time we were processing him, smiled for the mugshot. It was just kind of a different sort of reaction than you get from most of the criminals that you arrest and take into the marshal's office to book, So, Jerry, I don't know if you've ever had somebody smile and act happy after they were arrested.
Well, remember, I dealt with con men, so I didn't have a smiling mugshot, but I certainly had somebody who was trying to charm me during the process.
Absolutely. Yeah. They always think they're the smartest person in the room and they can talk their way out of it. So, yeah, I do know some con artists are very, gregarious that way. So you're exactly right. We had some plea negotiations. They tried to work out a plea deal with John Edwards and everything kind of fell through. So we ended up going to trial on the case in Greensboro, North Carolina. And Abby Lowell was John Edwards' attorney, who's Abby Lowell's actually representing Hunter Biden right now. The trial went on, I think, for like 4 weeks.
I have a newspaper article here that says 6 weeks, so I don't know.
You know what? It could have been 6 weeks. It seemed like an eternity. So I've probably got that wrong. As I say, it was back in I think 2012. So it's been 12 years. So my memory is a little foggy, but it was a long trial, and I would say it was probably the biggest case in the country going at the time because we had national news media down. And I know myself and Michelle Scott, the witness coordinator for the U.S. Attorney's Office, would bring witnesses into the courthouse because I know I'd done a lot of the interviews with the witnesses, and we'd go pick them up at their hotel. And for some reason, the court wouldn't allow them to go in a back entrance or anything. So we'd have to bring them right through the front, park the car right in front of the courthouse and bring them through the front. It was like a paparazzi when we'd go through. I mean, you could just hear all the clicks of the cameras going as we were walking up the steps. And I know, Jerry, I sent you a couple of pictures, but there's a whole bunch more of them. It was about every witness we walked in there. There were pictures. And I know I was, getting messages from people all over the country. It's like, we saw you on the news today. A friend of mine was in one of the legats in some place like Thailand or something who sent me a message, that I saw you walking somebody up the courthouse steps. One of them was in the New York Times. A friend of mine in New York said, hey, you're in the New York Times. It was just spectacle, I guess. And I certainly don't need to go through all the case again and how it was presented. But Andrew Young obviously was kind of the star witness for the government. And, he was a witness who had a lot to say, but to provide the evidence for the case. But he also had a lot of baggage. He'd gotten a lot of the money, used money to build his house. He had, I think, like $36,000 worth of dental work done that was paid for from some of the money they'd gotten. He'd also written a book, and some of the publishers had encouraged him in certain areas. It's like, hey, can you exaggerate this a little bit to make it sound better? Or, it'd be better if you said it like this. And so, of course, there were some instances where he'd testify to something, and then Abby Lowell would be like, well, this is what you told the court today, but in your book on page 72, it says something different, And so, anyhow, Andrew was a key component to the case. He took a lot of the hits, as far as different things that they could cross-examine him about. But trial lasted, like you say, Jerry, it very well could have lasted 6 weeks. One thing that I had kind of felt like, well, I tell you what, I'll jump to the verdict. When the jury went out, they deliberated for, I think it was like 9 or 10 days, and they came back and they acquitted him on one charge of receiving illegal campaign contributions and basically hung on the other charges. And so, basically ended up pretty much with a hung jury. And I'll say DOJ reviewed the situation, decided not to retry the case, which again, I wholeheartedly agree with it. I think I commend them again for taking their shot, bringing a case, indicting the case, knowing it was uncharted legal territory and the case was going to be really challenging. And we may not have won the case, but we took action against something that I think most people would agree was wrong and needed to be addressed. And I could kind of see a little bit, how the jury, I think in one way they may not have understood the case, because it was kind of hard to get people. It's hard to get people now when I talk to them about the case to understand it's not about a politician having an extramarital affair. It's about the money that was involved and the illegal campaign contributions and that kind of thing, and the importance of transparency of, where they're covering up this dark, deep secret that John Edwards has with his extramarital affair, and the voters don't know about it when they're making their decision, and how it could impact even national security.
Let's talk a little bit about that because to me, and I'm sure for you too, I see clearly where it was a violation of campaign laws. I mean, they skirted around in order to give him this money that he would use to keep the affair from the voters. What was it that you think the jury didn't get?
I tell you what, Jerry, I do not want a Monday morning quarterback on this because I commend, again, the DOJ for really going forward on a difficult case. And it would have been easy for them to basically walk away and decline it, say, we can't prosecute this. But, it's one of those things. I think part of the defense was that this wasn't so much to necessarily allow John Edwards maybe to continue to run for president as it was to protect his family, protect Elizabeth from the humiliation that was going to come if this came out, to, protect his young children, that sort of thing. And I also will say, the trial, there were several people that weren't able to testify. Obviously, Elizabeth Edwards couldn't testify because she had passed away. Fred Barron couldn't testify because he'd passed away. Bunny Mellon didn't testify. Both sides decided not to call Riel Hunter because everybody was a little afraid of, she was a little flaky, and what are we going to get out of her? John Edwards didn't testify, which obviously that's his right not to testify. And quite frankly, if I were his attorney, I wouldn't have put him on the stand either. Subjected him to the really grueling cross-examination that he would have gotten. I sometimes wonder if the jury kind of felt like, there were all these important people that we kind of didn't get to hear from. And, to prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt is a very, very high standard, as you know. They've never quantified it in court, but what is it, 98%, 97%, 99% or whatever. And if the jury's not sure, they shouldn't convict. Because I think the trial, as it went down the stretch, there was a lot of questions about, is Riel Hunter going to testify? Is John Edwards going to testify in his own defense, that sort of thing? And at the end of it, the answer was no, they didn't. And I'm not so sure if maybe the jury wasn't left with just a little bit of, we've just got some unanswered questions. I'm just speculating, Jerry. I don't know the answer to that. I do know I've had a bunch of cases go to jury, and it's like juries are just unpredictable. One thing, when you've had cases go to trial, you're always sitting there trying to predict which jurors are on your side and which ones aren't. And, there'll be some guy who's sitting there with his arms crossed and a frown on his face. And then afterwards, you'll find out that he was the one that was your biggest advocate. And then there's somebody who's nodding their head, looks like they're with you all the way. And then you find out that was the person that wanted to acquit the defendant. And so, anything I can say is just speculation. So I certainly do not want to act like I'm criticizing, the way the case was tried or the DOJ's courage to go forward with the case. You can always go back and say, look, maybe we should have done something differently. We should have put another witness on, or we shouldn't have gone this direction with our cross-examination of somebody. It's an inexact science. I'm a big believer that juries usually get things right, but, again, once in a while, you just, when you got to get 12 people convinced beyond a reasonable doubt, that's a high bar to clear.
In most DOJ or U.S. attorney trials, there is a success. We always joke that there's no indictment unless the U.S. Attorney's Office really feels like they're going to win this case. And in most situations, if somebody goes to trial, at the end, they will be convicted. So what was the atmosphere or the attitude of everyone with this loss?
Well, Jerry, to answer that, I was out in California climbing a mountain. Obviously, Tim Riley and I are very close. Tim's actually a business partner of mine now. He said people, I think, kind of had the idea that we gave it our best shot, basically took a shot at something that was no guarantee. I mean, I've had cases before where you knew the case was open and shut. For some reason, the guy wanted to go to trial, even though the odds were just stacked against him, and you felt pretty good that you were going to win. This was not one of those cases. From what Tim told me, people realized we gave it our best shot. And I commend DOJ for the fact that, we stood up for what we thought was right and, what we believed needed to be done, in this particular case. And I feel proud that I worked on this case and that the case went forward and that, we gave it the best shot that we did.
This was a national case because of all of the sensational things that we heard. And so I would imagine that you were spending a lot of time involved in this case, but you weren't there for the verdict. Maybe some people thought that you didn't believe in the case and that's why you weren't there.
Jerry, you're probably right. It probably was 6 weeks instead of 4 weeks, because I remember we had some kind of estimate of how long the case was going to last. And I had planned, my daughter and son and I like to climb mountains, and that's kind of one of our things we do. We like, Colorado's got these 14,000 foot mountains you can climb, and we like to do things outdoors. And my son was working out in California. He was an aerospace engineer for NASA out there. My daughter and I were going to go out there and join him, and we were going to climb Mount Whitney, the highest peak in the continental United States, out there in California. And I had scheduled it like 10 weeks from the start of the trial or something. I thought we had plenty of time. And as it turned out, the trial went longer and longer and longer. And then the jury went out, and I was there, for several days while the jury was deliberating. But it got to the point where it was running up on, I needed to hop on a plane, and, my daughter and I needed to go out and meet our son out in California, or we were going to miss this opportunity. You have to get a permit to climb certain mountains out there. You can't just show up any day you want. And our son had gotten us a permit for this particular day. And as I say, the case was over, the jury was deliberating. And when that's going on, there's nothing you can do. All anybody was doing was sitting around waiting for the jury to come back. There's no more investigation you can do. There's no more advocacy for your side. I mean, there's no role for an FBI agent to serve, in that particular purpose. And so Tim Riley was there, and he was keeping me up to date with, what was going on. So I made the decision, I'm going to go out to California and climb the mountain with our kids. And one reason we were doing it is we had plans to climb Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa in December of 2012. And so this was a little bit of a tuning ourselves up for Whitney's like 14,000 something feet. Mount Kilimanjaro is 19,340 feet. It's almost a mile higher than the highest mountain in the continental United States. So I decided to go out there and met up with my son and daughter. We went to climb the mountain and everything. And while literally, I think it was maybe right before we started the climb, I started getting phone messages from Tim Riley that the jury's coming back. And, he tells me what the verdict is. I got a little bit of flack from that for being gone, for that particular thing. But there's certain times, when you have to choose family over your work. And as it turned out, in this particular instance, we went on our trip to Africa at the end of the year in December, and we climbed, my son and daughter and I climbed, made it to the summit of Mount Kilimanjaro, stood on the highest point in Africa. And, it's actually the highest freestanding mountain in the world. Obviously, Mount Everest and some of those are higher, but they're part of a mountain range, and Mount Kilimanjaro stands by itself. And then we had a safari, an African wildlife safari that was really good. And then, like I say, our son was working at NASA as an aerospace engineer, just really brilliant young man. And in June of 2013, he was in a car accident and passed away. And I'm sorry, Jerry, for getting emotional, but looking back, it's like, I don't have any regrets about leaving and going and spending the time with our son and our daughter out in California and missing the jury verdict, because I didn't know it at the time, but our time with our son was limited, and people could criticize me for, leaving and not being there for the return of the jury. But that's a decision in life that I made that, I have absolutely no regrets about. And I'm glad we spent that time together. With our son passing away about a year later, I know I did the right thing.
Thank you for sharing that, because there have been many, many times that I've talked to someone on this podcast, and they talk about the sacrifices that they made that could have led to a divorce or missing special moments with their own children that they'll never get back. And you sharing that, I'm hoping that it will allow people listening, whether they're agents with the FBI or in law enforcement or work a professional career, to think about those sacrifices and to make the best decision that they can make for themselves and their family. So I really appreciate you sharing that with us. And of course, I give you my condolences for the loss of your son.
Thank you, Jerry. And like I say, he was a brilliant young man. He was valedictorian at NC State in his aerospace engineering there, which is way over my head. And he got an internship to work at NASA while he was at NC State, and NASA was paying for a scholarship for him. And he worked out there, and then they liked him so much, they ended up hiring him on for a full-time position. And as I say, brilliant young man. I'm very, very grateful for the 25 years we had with him. And I'm a big believer that we lose somebody, but we're going to see him again. And so counting on that when my time comes, that we'll get to see him again in the future.
And his name?
Alexander. Yeah.
Alex. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Absolutely. I love talking about him. He was a wonderful young man, and we did so many things together. the people of the FBI are very dedicated. And that's what I admire about FBI employees. And I tell people when anybody asks me about the FBI, it's like these are the best people that you'll ever work with in your life. I mean, people are so committed to the mission of the FBI and dedicated, but it is a job where you can work some long hours. One thing I think my family understood was that there were times when, there'd be a kidnapping case going down and it was a life or death thing, and you basically have to be away from your family. But if there's a way, like I say, this situation with the jury being out and there's nothing I can do and there's no point of me just sitting there at the courthouse waiting for a verdict that might come in 10 minutes and it might not come in 10 days. And so I chose family over work in that instance. And my folks at the FBI backed me up. There was no backlash or anything there. So most of the people I work with in the FBI had that attitude, that you put in the best effort on the case. And there are certain times when it's a life or death matter and you don't have a choice. But there are other times when you have a choice to go home with your family and you need to do that. I can tell you this, Jerry, I've worked a lot of political corruption cases. Again, we had cases on the Speaker of the House that we prosecuted and convicted in North Carolina. He was a very powerful man. Had a case on the governor, Mike Easley, and he actually pled guilty to a felony conviction. I've actually had two members of Congress, one when I was up in D.C. and one down in North Carolina, U.S. congressmen that we've prosecuted and convicted. And some of them have been Republicans, some of them have been Democrats. I've seen so much of kind of the ugly underbelly of how the political system works.
You became this public corruption agent. That became your area of expertise in the FBI.
Very proud of the work we were able to do, and hopefully we made the North Carolina political system a little more honest and transparent for the citizens that live here in North Carolina.
Which I am one, so I certainly appreciate that. So what are you doing now? I know you're extremely busy, so what are you up to?
I teach a forensic accounting class at Wake Tech Community College. I just teach as an adjunct. I like working with the students and enjoy helping them like people helped me, get where I wanted to go. We have a consulting business. We call it SRS Consulting Services, and it's me, and the R is Tim Riley, the guy that I've spoken about a lot during this interview. Tim and I had worked together on a lot of cases, and then we partnered up with a woman named Kim Strack, who was the former executive director of the North Carolina State Board of Elections. We had worked with Kim on a lot of these cases because most of them involve an election campaign finance angle. And so we worked with Kim, and then Kim actually hired me to come work with her at the Board of Elections after I retired from the FBI 3 or 4 or 5 years ago or whatever. We decided that, we were all at a place where we're looking for something new, and we decided to join up and started a consulting business. So we do forensic accounting cases. Kim, obviously with her election background, she can help with election matters. We do white-collar crime cases. We've been hired by government agencies to work different kinds of fraud cases. We got our private investigator licenses so we could handle kind of any kind of case that comes in the door. So whatever somebody wants to bring to us, we'll take a look at it. If it looks like something that we might be able to help with, we'll take the case on and see what we can do to help the client.
Whenever you have any leisure time, are you still climbing mountains?
My wife and I actually took a trip last year to the Galapagos Islands and Machu Picchu. We did the Galapagos Islands and we went over to Peru to Machu Picchu, and we went through the ruins. And for anybody that's ever seen the picture of Machu Picchu, there's this big tall mountain behind it, and it's called Huayna Picchu. And it looks like it basically goes straight up into the air. If you ever, Google Machu Picchu, just take a look at that. And our guide, when we were going through the ruins, she pointed to the mountain. She goes, "Would you like to climb that?" And I said, "Are you kidding me? It looks like it goes straight up. You almost have to have technical climbing equipment or something to get up to the top of that mountain." She goes, "No, the Incas built this staircase, and it's a really steep staircase, and it's really treacherous from the bottom up to the top." And she's like, "If you want to do that, we can come back tomorrow." And I'm like, "Well, hey, I'd regret not taking that opportunity to see if I could climb to the top of the mountain. I mean, that's certainly something my kids would have told me, you need to do that, Dad." And so we got up early the next morning and went and we climbed all the way to the top of the mountain that sits behind Machu Picchu. And we were literally looking down on Machu Picchu on the ruins from up on the top of Huayna Picchu. When we go out to Colorado, if there's a mountain that looks like I can do it or something, I might give it a try. A friend of mine had a permit to climb the Half Dome in Yosemite National Park a few years ago, and so I went out and climbed the Half Dome. That was iconic mountain, that one that looks like somebody sliced it in half, sits at the end of the Yosemite Valley. So still try to do a little bit of that if I can.
That's fantastic. I love to travel too.
You've been many great places, but if you haven't been to the Galapagos
I
Islands,
have not.
put that on your
Okay,
list.
it's on the list now. So we have come to the end, and I love to give my guest the last word. So what would you like to say?
Well, I'll tell you what, there's two things I'd like to say. On this particular case, it was quite an intensive investigation, one of those kind of cases that it was just, a real challenge, but also rewarding in a lot of ways. But there's a couple of things I wanted to say. One is John Edwards' wife, Elizabeth. I always felt so sorry for her. And she passed away. We weren't able to interview her. I think we actually tried to interview her, but she did not want to be interviewed, which I completely understand. When you've only got so much time to live, you don't want to waste any of your time talking to the FBI. You need to be with your family. But she'd had cancer. The Edwards had a teenage son, Wade, that was in a car accident, passed away. So she'd actually lost a child. And, having gone through that myself, I know how painful that is. And she'd had cancer. She'd recovered from cancer. Then she got cancer again. The cancer came back and she ended up passing away. And then she just had this, probably had to be humiliating situation with John Edwards being, having this extramarital affair and having a child with his mistress. And I remember just feeling so sorry for her. And she, very strong, resilient woman, but, I hope she's at peace. She's with her son and she's at peace now. To wrap it up, the case didn't turn out exactly the way we wanted, but in my opinion, it was a very important case. And I'll tell you why. John Edwards, people I don't think realize how close he was to maybe being the president of the United States, because he was running for the Democratic nomination in early 2008. They were having the Iowa caucuses, and it was him, Barack Obama, and Hillary Clinton. And first of all, I think the Democrats were going to be favored in that election because people were kind of disenchanted with some of the things that had happened in the prior administration. So I think the Democrats were going to ride a little bit of a positive wave there. And history would tell you, at the time, we'd never had a woman president and we'd never had an African American president. And John Edwards was the white male that was in that field running for president. But I think, his chances were strong. Fortunately, Barack Obama prevailed because obviously John Edwards turned out to have some serious character flaws that were a huge problem. But in addition, if he had gotten elected, with this deep, dark secret that he was holding, let's say somehow they had managed to, the National Enquirer hadn't pursued this investigation as hard as they did and, found out, about this extramarital affair, and he'd managed to keep that covered up and been elected president. Can you imagine what kind of potential there would have been for coercion and blackmail? And, if a foreign government found out about this and to be able to use that to put pressure on Edwards to do whatever it is they might want him to do, who knows? The case didn't quite play out the way we would have necessarily thought that it might have. But again, I'm proud to have been part of the investigation and the team that basically put forth the effort to try to hold John Edwards and these people involved accountable for the things that they had done that were wrong. It might not have resulted in a conviction, but that doesn't diminish the pride that I feel in having done our best to try to bring justice in a situation that needed somebody to look into it and take some action.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find a photo of Chuck Stuber, links to news articles about the investigation and trial of John Edwards, as well as case-related images, and links to other FBI retired case file review episodes featuring public corruption investigations. There is also a photo of Chuck with his children at the summit of Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, Africa, and another one with Chuck and his daughter Andy spreading some of Alex's ashes at the top of Mount Fuji. This episode is dedicated to Alex Stuber. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.